Welcome to our continuing Visiting Artists Lecture Series. It's really glad you're here. I hope you'll constantly pay attention to the artists that we bring in. It's so valuable for you to learn about contemporary art and to learn about different approaches and ideas. Truly, every contemporary artist is like a philosophy into themselves. And today is no exception. We're welcoming Richard Dupont. And I've known Richard for quite a while, partially because I knew one of his breakaway pieces, which I forget the title, the one that was at the Lever House?
Terminal Stage.
Terminal Stage, yeah. An amazing piece, absolutely extraordinary. You'll see it today. And also because we've been in shows together and sort of share a lot of, aspects of practice. So we've kind of been colleagues over the years. He's born in 1968, and he's an American contemporary artist who lives and works in New York. His artistic practice includes installations, sculptures, prints, paintings, and drawings. He received a BA in the departments of visual art and archeology from Princeton University. Richard Dupont's work draws from a variety of themes and references and has been described as post-digital and post-internet. His work references the body art, process art, and systems art movements of the 1960s and 70s. However, he uses 3D digital models of bodies and objects rather than things themselves. Dupont has had his body scanned at a General Dynamics facility on the Wright-Patterson Air Force Base in 2004, very early, by the way, for scanning technology, and has been working from these images, translating it into both 2 and 3 dimensions. An interest in the implications of biometric technologies underpins much of his work. His work is currently included in 2 museum exhibitions, selections from the MCASD's collection, that's the Museum of Contemporary Art, San Diego, and Out of Hand, Materializing the Post-Digital. Actually, this is a little bit of an older biography. That show is, is it in?
No, now it's in.
Oh, it's in Sydney.
Sydney, Australia.
Oh, okay, okay. Sorry about that. Mm-hmm. Okay, that's up to the minute. Sorry, that's correct.
It's the same show, basically.
Yeah, Museum of Out of Hand, Materializing the Post-Digital. His prior museum exhibitions include the Museum of Arts and Design, the Queens Museum, the Middlebury College Museum of Art, the Hudson Valley Center for Contemporary Art. He has presented major installations at the Lever House, the Flag Art Foundation, both in New York City. His works are included in the collections of the Museum of Modern Art, the Whitney Museum of American Art, the Museum of Fine Arts Boston, the Cleveland Museum of Art, the Brooklyn Museum, the Hammer Museum, and the New York Public Library Print Collection, among many others. In 2014, he was awarded the Museum of Arts and Design Visionary Award. So, as you can see, Richard is quite distinguished, and we're really lucky to have him. Please join me in welcoming.
Is that working? Oh, yeah. Wow, thanks, Michael. That's really quite an introduction. I'm going to stick mostly to sculpture today instead of talking about some of the other things that I've done, making prints and digital animations and drawings and more recently even paintings. But I just thought it would be good to maybe sort of focus in a little bit and just stick with the sculpture, because that's the main thing that I do, is make sculpture and make installations out of sculptures as well. And so we're going to just kind of do that. I'll just give a little bit of kind of a overarching kind of theoretical or conceptual kind of orientation for much of what I've done. And a lot of it's come out of this interest in, early on I was interested in the idea in art of the 60s and the 70s where the artists would use their own body as the raw material. And there was just something about the immediacy of that and the agency of that I found fascinating. And I also felt that there was this kind of inherent political, not overt political, but sort of a built-in component of that gesture that could be political, the notion of using one's own body as this raw material, as a sort of a symbol of things being done to bodies or things happening to bodies, or just the idea of a body in general as something that was malleable is inherently, I think, kind of political, because things happen to us, all the time, and we don't always have control, as we've seen recently, over what does happen to us. And I think that the idea of us being, completely in control of what's going on is something that we have to project onto ourselves to kind of give ourselves a sense of security. But in general, we really don't have much control over it. And the idea of kind of giving one's body over to an activity or to a performance or to an extreme kind of action does have philosophical and even political implications to it. And a lot of the artists of the 60s and 70s really caught on to this. You know, think of Anna Mendieta, whose performances were very extreme sometimes. Or Chris Burden, who would lock himself in a tiny closet for 2 weeks, or have someone shoot him in the arm with a bullet, or crawl across broken glass. And of course, you think of the Vienna actionists, who are the sort of first really out there kind of performance artists in Vienna at the turn of the century, or not at the turn of the century, a little later on. And a lot of what they did would even be sort of self-mutilation on stage, these really extreme gestures. And then we've seen that kind of mitigated through history from the extremity of of a Vienna actionist, tearing an animal carcass to shreds on stage and covering themselves in blood, to artists of the 60s and 70s making statements with their bodies that were kind of commensurate with the moment in which they lived. And of course, more recently, we have an artist like Paul McCarthy, who's a Los Angeles-based artist who's getting up there. I mean, he's probably around 70 years old. And he did kind of restagings of a lot of Vienna actionist performances, but instead of using blood and guts and real extreme materials like that, he used ketchup and mayonnaise and these kind of American consumer products, and often put on crazy hats and masks and reenacted this kind of a hysterical type of performance that was akin to a crazy sitcom or a television show, or something that was much more in the vernacular of the aesthetics of the time in which it was made, but no less political in many ways. So anyway, I was influenced quite a bit by a lot of those artists, and I ended up deciding that instead of using my own body, I wanted to make a digital version of myself, and then use that digital version of my own body, make a surrogate, and then use that as the material, as the kind of protagonist. And so that's an image of me having a head scan. This is the result of the head scan. You're looking at a digital model of the scan. You can see there's a lot of detail that was captured by the scan. All of those little triangles are polygons. Polygon is a unit of measure in a digital model, so the more polygons, the more detail in a digital model. And you can maybe start with something that's extremely detailed, and then you can, in 3D software, you can reduce the geometry and make the model much, much, much more simple until you're literally left with one triangle. So it's basically just, there's a mathematical underpinning to a lot of it. And so that's just the section of the head after the scan. And I made some works where I did the scans of my head, and then using really rudimentary 3D software, I kind of distorted the head on different axes, making it thinner or wider. And I made some sculptures based on those heads. Ultimately, I decided I wanted to do my entire body. So in order to do that, I had two options. One was to go to California and contract with a movie studio in California and pay a good amount of money. And the other option was to fly to Dayton, Ohio, which was much cheaper, and work with General Dynamics. And the reason I ended up, with that decision was that once I found out, and this is around 2002, I started researching this, and I did my first head scan, the one you were just looking at. I did that in 2002 with a company on Long Island, a video game company that was making the game Doom at that time. That was and so I was able to get the head scan, but I went online and started searching around where to do a full body scan. And there was only one company that really makes the scanners, and there's only two industries that were really using them. One was, as I said, the movie business, and the other one was the military industrial complex. So it turns out you could go to General Dynamics in Ohio, which is on the Air Force Base, Wright-Patterson Air Force Base. And anybody can go, or at least you could when I went, and pay a certain fee, which was really low. And you could get that you can get your body scanned. The only caveat was that I had to agree to take part in a military experiment, basically. So I signed the waiver and I went in and they were scanning. It was a survey, it was an anthropometry survey. So what they were doing was taking 10,000 people and scanning their bodies. Most of those people were military personnel, but they were happy to have civilians to come in to sort of like supplement the research. And they took all of that data and they would average it together to create anything that would interface with the body. So clothing, flak jackets, ejection seats, helmets. And the idea was to just design a more perfect thing. So I went there and I did the scan, but part of the survey was also doing this anthropometry, which is body measurement. And so for this, they took out the calipers and literally measured every section of my body. And ultimately, I ended up with this sort of 3D replica of based on the original scan. But because they wouldn't let me take my clothes off on the base, I actually had to come back to the studio and do all these separate castings of different body parts. Also, I did some castings of body parts that I wanted more detail from, like the hand. I had to recast my whole midsection, so you can see here we've got this kind of ridiculous cardboard mold that we've fabricated and pouring alginate in it to sort of cast my entire midsection, which we did. And then we took all these kind of pieces and we scanned them and then grafted them into the other scan, the full body scan. And all of this took a long time. It was kind of a pain in the neck. It was a process. But the end result was to generate this full body model that you just saw prior to that in the red background image. And then you can see here's a small 24-inch version in polyurethane resin in the foreground right here. And those are 24-inch tall figures. So once I had that 3D model, what I then started doing was distorting and manipulating it in the computer. So most of what I was doing in the beginning were these sort of simple distortions, kind of anamorphic distortions. So sort of stretching it out along one axis or another axis. And so that as the viewer moved around the piece was sort of shifting and changing. And I like that idea very much. There was no fixed position on this sculpture. And what I liked about it was that it took the sort of the idea of the classical out of it, the statuesque kind of out of it, because anytime you're dealing with figuration, you're going to have the baggage of that history, which is in some ways it can be a good thing when you're operating with the figure, because the history can actually be something that you can draw on and sort of remake. But a lot of times it can also be a baggage because there's just been so much figurative sculpture, figuration in general in art, that it's very hard to, I think, to just sort of reinvent the wheel. And so these would change as the viewer moved around them, and in that sense, they really became about the viewer moving around them, and the viewer then became implicated into the experience. So this is a small mold. I'm going to show you a lot of process images because I think it's kind of important to get a sense of process with regard to work that uses digital technology, because there's a lot of work involved with it, but people think you just press a button and it comes out, which couldn't be further from the truth. So this is an image of a whole bunch of these figures. They're all 24 inches tall, and they're all distorted on different axes. So you can see, this guy's really stretched out front to back. This guy's incredibly the opposite. He's just compressed front to back, so he's very, very thin. And so around this time, I did an exhibition of those works and was approached by the Lever House Art Collection to do a commission. They were commissioning 2 or 3 artists a year to make these big installations to go into the lobby of the Lever House, which is the first international style glass and steel skyscraper in Manhattan. Was originally designed by Gordon Bunshaft, the architect, and Isamu Noguchi, the sculptor, designed the sculpture garden, which is part of the footprint of this building. And that was in 1953. And then over many years, it just became kind of a banal corporate lobby space. And then about 10 years ago, two people bought a real estate company bought the building, and they restored the building back to its original condition, including the Noguchi Sculpture Garden, and they initiated this thing called the Lever House Art Collection. So when Bunshaft designed the building, it was originally designed to show modern sculpture, and because as you'll see in images to come, it's a huge glass lobby. All the windows are glass on all sides around it, and so as pedestrians walk past it in Midtown Manhattan, they see what's inside. So originally they did have sculpture in there, but that ended pretty quickly, and then it was this sort of corporate lobby with nothing going on for many years until about 10 years ago, when they got the idea to sort of, kind of go back and reimagine the beginning of what the building had been. So what you're seeing here is me starting to work on this commission. This is one of the figures. It's upside down, obviously. Parts of it, the legs here and the torso and the arms are all, these are all foam, and they're carved using CNC milling out of foam. And for those of you who don't know what that is, that's essentially like a subtractive process where a machine that's responding to commands from a computer can carve something in a very detailed way out of a number of different materials. You probably all know that you have a great robot right now over at the Power. Michael has been able to orchestrate that, which is fantastic. It's an incredible piece of technology. It's something that a lot of sculptors use today to enlarge things from small maquettes to big things. But for me, it was also kind of, again, this extension of putting myself, or the idea of the artist putting their body into the space of technology. So sort of starting with the scan and then into the 3D manipulation in the computer, and then ultimately even having the machines kind of working on the object itself, all for me were kind of inherent to the idea of the body in confrontation or in relationship to technology. And so this is different than traditional self-portraiture, where it's a picture that someone paints of somebody. This is a new kind of a conception of the self that's been going on for a number of years now, where the self is thought of more as a construct, and the construct can assume other selves or other identities, and even go so far as to be about the loss of identity. And that, for me, is central to my work. I feel that a lot of what underpins the works of the sculptures that I've made is this notion of the loss of identity in the age of information, to the encroachment of biometric technologies, just the reducing of ourselves to the digital footprint. All of these things really do speak to the sort of end of what we have previously understood to be sort of the history of humanism and the humanist project. So here's another image. You can see the head is head's different from the body. As I said, the body was carved using the CNC milling, and then for more detailed areas, I used 3D printing. And 3D printing is a little different. You probably all know what that is now. Pretty much everybody does. A few years ago, people really didn't, but now it's become ubiquitous. At the beginning, it was really hard to find places to get 3D prints done, and I had to do a lot of work to find places. But within a couple of years of starting with that, using 3D printing, and there was this kind of incredible growth of the industry on the web all of a sudden. So for areas that need more detail, generally 3D printing will get you that. And I decided to use those for things like the head, the hands, and places like that where I needed or wanted a little more detail in the figure. And so this is, you can see here, these 3D printed parts. And you can see the feet are different because, again, this particular figure that these are going to be a part of was distorted kind of on a diagonal axis. So the idea is like you use this kind of really basic distortion software in a CAD program, which just kind of stretches a figure out through kind of uniformly on one axis. So if you pass it through the body at an angle, certain parts of the body get just twisted and distorted in different ways. And as you walk around it, there's a perspective on all of these figures where the thing kind of snaps into alignment and it looks normal. It looks kind of like regular. And then as you continue to move, then it starts to twist and distort. But I was also really interested just kind of in the details of like what happened to the individual parts of the body as this was, as the, they underwent this kind of distortion in the computer. And then you can see here, this is the studio. I've done almost all of the work that I've made that didn't require huge foundries or whatever over the years in my own studio. Usually just working with 1 or 2 assistants. And this is a shot of the studio kind of in the middle of working on the Lever House Commission. This is a fully cast figure here. Here's another one here that is in process. You can see that the 3D printed heads and the CNC milled bodies and the hands, and it's all been joined together and then painted and then sanded so that all those seams went away. All the many, many seams of all the different parts went away. And then this one then got molded. You can see over here is a giant mold. So sort of looking at 3 stages of the thing. Again, the same here. You can see all the parts in that figure on the right, and on the left, a more or less close to finished figure. Here's an image of molding the figure. Another image of the mold showing the huge mother mold on top and all the parts of that mold. There's a number of parts that had to be broken apart. Here it is all broken apart and getting ready for casting. To cast these, we brush this polyurethane resin. It's an archival resin into the mold, and then you can see on top of that we've got this fiberglass sheeting with epoxy. So we brush the resin in many layers, get that built up, and then we laid in these fiberglass sheets with epoxy. This is exactly how they would the process they would use, in boat building. So very strong, very thin, and the idea with these sculptures was to create an internal armature that would hold them together, really without too many rods. So we used the fiberglass for strength. That's an image of one of it looks like a meth lab. It's one of the rooms in the studio. Very toxic, a lot of these materials. You have to be careful when you use them. Use adequate ventilation, use the right respiration, et cetera, et cetera. Here's one that's popped out of the mold. You can see the flange, which is where the 2 halves of the mold meet up, and some of the material kind of squishes out, and that's that kind of halo around the thing. And all of that has to get trimmed off and hand finished. The finishing on these things is crazy and takes many, many, many hours of patching and sanding and filing and patching and filing and on and on and on until the surfaces are uniform. And you can see here is in sort of process, various stages. The one in the middle hasn't had the arms glued on yet. Again, more work on it. And here's an image of the final piece. The final piece was 9 figures. They're all 80 inches tall, so they're just a little outside of the scale of a human being, and function as one complete installation as a group together. So, as you move around the space, it's hard to get a sense of it without actually being there and walking around them, or having a video where they are spinning. And I could probably show you one actually online if I could pull it up in a second, but maybe I'll do that at the end. So this one here, if you walked around this hulking kind of character, from the back and the front, it would look normal. And then on the side is only where you see it stretch out. So you can see, all of the action going on around outside of this building. The idea was to have these sculptures function almost performatively. They're static sculptures in the sense that they don't move. They're, in many ways they're classical or statuesque. And I definitely was interested in thinking a lot about the Kouros figure, the early Greek figures, when I was making these, and the sort of mathematical thinking behind the making of those Kouros figures. But at the same time, as I said before, as you move around them, they're changing, and this creates this strange physiological effect in the viewer, and thus it's activated by the movement of the viewer. And the idea was to put them in a space where you couldn't help but engage them because you're walking by, and something like 3,000 people a day walk by this building, and as they're walking by, they kind of see this thing out of the corner of their eye, and then it sort of changes as they move, and the idea was that it would then pull people into the lobby to kind of engage with them. And ultimately that did happen. Lots of people came in to kind of explore them and touch them and walk around them and try and wrap their heads around what they were. And so at the same time, I'll show a few other pieces that I made in the same kind of idea, the same kind of body of work. This is a much smaller figure, and it's just been distorted again on this one axis. So as from the side, it appears to be incredibly thin, obviously evocative of Giacometti in some ways. But I went through a number of different iterations. The idea was like once I had the digital model, then I could do all kinds of things with it, things that one couldn't do with one's own body, for example. And that was part of the thinking behind making a digital replica, was that I could do things to it and with it that couldn't really be done in a real performance with a real body. And in this one, we've got like just this waves pattern software to kind of pass a wave through the model. And then this is extremely difficult to then turn back into a figurative sculpture. It's also 80 inches tall. This is the piece that was in the Museum of Arts and Design show and is now currently in the museum at the Powerhouse Museum in Australia. Here's a much more weird and distorted one, which I like quite a bit. It's almost becomes like unrecognizable. I think of it as like this kind of proto-surrealist kind of thing. And there's this force that was applied from above the head, sort of pushing the head into two, and then there's another wave that kind of comes through and sweeps through it, and you can see what's happening to the foot here. So there's this kind of comic element to them too, but there's also this expressionistic kind of, sort of frightening sort of side to them. This is a more traditional one. This one's kind of mid-sized. It's not as big as the earlier ones and not as small as the ones I just showed you. I think it's 60 inches tall, which is just slightly underneath human size. And it has this really weird alien. It feels like a strange alien creature because it's like big enough to be kind of one of us, but not quite. I haven't shown this slide in a long time, but I thought I would throw it in there. I was asked around this time this is like 2009, by the Armory Show to make well, actually, this piece already existed, but then the Armory Show decided they wanted to show it. And they wanted to put it in the VIP lounge of the Armory Show that year, which they did. This is the VIP lounge. And there's just something really perverse about this to me. It's like seeing a piece like this. And this is 180 figures. I'd made a lot of these upright figures, and I got interested then in the idea of making this kind of collapsed situation. And this is during the Iraq War. In large measure, I made this because I was just constantly, as we all were, bombarded by this sort of abstract number of those dead every day in the war, juxtaposed with the celebrity news or the weather or whatever advertisement was thrown in there, and it really just took the severity completely out of the news of the daily news of the dead, and that juxtaposition was very disturbing to me. I think more than anything I've ever made, for some reason I really just felt compelled at that particular moment to act out of this frustration that I felt about what was going on, and about the sort of way in which it was being sort of processed or presented through culture. And so I made this piece of 180 of these small figures, and each of them, we cast them, and then before the resin had fully cured, we pulled them out of the mold while they were still malleable, and we just started piling them onto each other and building up this kind of horrific pile. And it was very hard technically to make it. And it ended up coming apart in sections, but we made it, and ultimately it was shown here at the Armory Show in this bizarre, just having it in this context I find to be really bizarre. It was actually not a great place for them to put it, I don't think. It doesn't really make any sense. It takes the seriousness out of it. I mean, having someone like ordering an espresso while, they just didn't get it at all. But that happens sometimes. So anyway, so this is all, that work was made, as I said, in 2008 or late 2008 going into 2009. This is also the time of the sort of setting onset, I should say, of the financial collapse. And I set about later that year starting to make some new works, all of which were done alone by me in the studio. And I started to incorporate a lot of the materials that I had accumulated over many, many years of like making other work and living life. And I had accumulated a lot of junk. I think sculptors in general tend to hoard things because just by nature of what you do, you're dealing with material all the time. You're building up all kinds of materials, byproducts of other stuff, leftovers, fragments, tests, just you name it. And it built up enormously. And I was trying to figure out what to do with all this junk. And so finally, I decided what I would do is I made these molds and I just put all of the material in the mold, and they were head molds. And so you can see here there are some 3D prints, some antique mannequin heads, some other life casts that I made. So in many ways, like the idea of taking something that occurred in an earlier body of work and repurposing it for a new thing, I really love that idea. I think it's an interesting way to work, and it allows for things to kind of proceed intuitively. Also, then all of the meaning and the memory and the sort of history that's built up in those other things, those other times and experiences and objects, somehow then you can bring that into a new thing and it becomes part of it. So I like that idea a lot. And also they were extremely cathartic to make. I made something like 45 of these heads. And the heads are big. I mean, they're like 26 inches tall. They weigh close to 200 pounds. They're solid resin poured in around these objects. So I would fill the mold up with objects and then pour the resin in, and the resin would just fill all the space that was not occupied by an object, creating a solid form. And the resin is a UV stable archival material. So everything that's inside of these heads is completely immune to the effects of ultraviolet light. So they will function as time capsules in many ways. The color of the objects that's inside them won't fade over hundreds of years. And so they're sort of these memory banks or time capsules. And the idea of the way they'll look in 50 years from now, for example, to me is quite interesting because they'll be capturing something about the color of our particular moment and the character of the moment. Here's an installation with a number of them together in one room. For me, in the beginning, when I started making these, I really imagined like one installation. I tend to think that way. I think of things in groups. So often I'll make individual things that then really are meant to be they can be sort of separated out, but they're really meant to be kind of seen as one collective grouping together. And this is an example of that. I imagined that I would do like 50 of these and have this huge installation of all of these heads filled with all this stuff, and then it would really be about the scope of information that was inside these heads. As you walk around them and scrutinize them, you just see the diversity of stuff. There's just so much material in these heads. Ultimately, I think I used something like 8,000 pounds of stuff in these heads. Most of it was junk that I had accumulated. So purging all of that was great, and then finding this kind of upcycling of it, or a lot of it was just garbage. I mean, I was collecting a lot of the trash from my house and from the studio and using that in these works. And so that felt right, but it also had this kind of connection to material culture, which I find interesting, this whole notion of this anthropological kind of study of like our stuff and what it says about us. This is an exhibition that I was invited to do in Middlebury, the museum, the college, and they wanted to take one of the heads and some other works of mine and juxtapose it with objects from their permanent collection from different periods. And these are some works from the Chinese galleries. And then I'm going to run through a bunch of slides quickly here. And this just to give you a sort of a sense of like the thought process that I've used over the years. I try, even though I have used and become known for using digital technology in sculpture, the process of using that stuff, using that technology can be it's really time consuming, it's expensive, can become pigeonholed by it. But I think most importantly, sometimes it doesn't allow for this kind of spontaneous, intuitive growth to happen, which I think is crucial to making art. And so this is an image of me a little later on doing a traditional Lifecast, having a traditional Lifecast done to my head, which is not a pleasant experience. I wouldn't suggest anyone go through it. You've got nothing except one little hole to breathe for like an hour. So you have no hearing, nothing, and no eyesight, obviously. And so you really have to sort of like calm yourself down when you go into doing it and try to remain calm throughout it. And so I ended up with a Lifecast of the head, which was different in character to the scan. The scan really feels like this sterile, representation of the body. And it is. That's the idea behind that whole thing, that it's really about this kind of like precision of information. This is the traditional Lifecast, the death mask, the life mask, whatever you want to call it, which goes back way further into history, into early sculptural ideas and processes. This, you can see, is a much bigger enlargement. This is a 40-inch tall enlargement of that head. And that was CNC milled out of a high-density foam. This is an enormous mold that we made from that head. The mold weighed something like 700 pounds, I think. And this is an enormous resin head. I made one really big one, and this is it. It's 40-some inches tall on the base. It gets up into like 60-some inches. And it weighs 700 pounds. It's solid resin filled with objects, same as the others. These objects I collected over a 10-year period. So it was... And so after I made that giant resin head, I had that green head that you saw before left over, and I really thought, I got to do something with this. Maybe if I brush a coat of rubber over it, that it could become something interesting. So I brushed a coat of rubber over it, and it really didn't work out. And then I thought, oh, no, now what? I've got to get this rubber off. So I went about trying to kind of peel the rubber off and salvage the green thing. And much to my surprise, I was able to peel the rubber off of this head in one giant piece. Similar to the way you've seen probably those like ceramic glove molds in like junk shops. And that's how they make rubber gloves. They brush latex over this like ceramic hand, let it dry, and then peel it off. And this was the same idea. This whole thing came off like a mask or like some kind of evisceration. And I immediately nailed it to the wall. Like that was the first impulse. And it just was, to me, it was like satisfying so many things. And it just came completely accidentally out of a mistake in the studio. It was just one of those moments where I really felt like, sometimes if you allow yourself to go into a place that could be just a total failure, that you never know, like something really exciting might come out of that limbo. And that's kind of what happened here. So this isn't the first one. The first one that I did that to, I pinned it on the wall. I thought, this is doing so many things that I'm excited about. But the material that I've used was pretty terrible. It started ripping almost immediately. So I went back in and tried to find this really good archival silicone and to try to replicate the process with something that would produce a more archival result. And I did. And this is an exhibition with a number of them in it. You can see 3 of them here. And they are using a better silicone, but they're still quite fragile. And a number of them were sold and then had to come back to me for restoration. And because, one of the reasons I really like these is because for me, they echoed, but in a new way or a different way, some of the work of the 60s and the 70s, like Eva Hesse or Robert Overby, artists that I greatly admired, or even Bruce Nauman. The idea of using the body, again, as a raw material, and also the idea of the process of making the thing being the real main story of the thing. So the process is inherent in looking at it. You look at it and you're like, that looks like it was peeled skin or peeled away. See, the way in which it was made is revealed in the thing and as part of the story of the thing as much as anything else is. So that's kind of what process art is. And I think process art to me, the process is really everything. It's sort of what underpins everything and what you kind of like hang your hat on and what you sort of rely on when you make work is to set up a process and then kind of, and then that becomes your kind of, your security in a way, or the thing that organizes what you're doing. So then I went, again, jumping from those hanging rubber works, I was approached right around that time to come up with a proposal for a very large public sculpture to be placed in front of the Museum of Arts and Design during the exhibition at the museum. And I decided I would propose one of the rubber works. So here's an image of us taking one of those rubber pieces and we're 3D scanning it. So again, from the sort of Lifecast to the skin to the sort of hanging rubber thing, then scanned again and on its way back to a solid form again. So here's a 3D model of this rubber head. It was scaled up to 15 feet tall. And then here's an image of some of the sections of it getting milled out of foam. Here's an image of it getting cast in aluminum at the foundry. You can see all the sprues coming off. These are all evidence of where the aluminum was poured into the mold and allowed to sort of travel down and melt out the interior and replace the interior. And here it is. It's been all those cast sections of aluminum have been welded together and kind of sanded and grinded down and blended down and kind of formed into this one singular thing. And here it is in front of the museum at 15 feet tall. And again, going from one thing to the next and now back to this kind of hard thing. And the idea also of it being this kind of anti-monument for me was important, that there's this quality of it being kind of collapsed or entropic that is important and runs kind of, I think, against the notion of monumentality. Also the idea of the peeling, or the stripping away, the peeling away of identity is part of it. So that's a picture of it in front of the museum. And got a couple more minutes. I'll just show, I'm going to wrap it up soon. Anyway, so this is a fairly recent work. And I decided for the last exhibition that I did, which was a little over a year ago in New York, that I would show some things that I had been kind of working on for a while. They were these more kind of crazy distortions. Some of them were based on my body, and some of them were based on scans of friends of mine that I started to do. I've been making scans of other people now, having, I think, exhausted, and I've made a lot of work based on that original model that I showed you. So this is an image of a friend of mine, and her body is, again, put through this kind of funhouse mirror kind of distortion in 3D software. And this is an image of us carving this thing. I decided I wanted to make that piece in wood. So I'm working with the Walla Foundry out in Washington State, which is an amazing foundry. If you're interested at all in sculpture fabrication, I would advise you to go and check out their website. What Dylan and his team are doing out there right now is really unbelievable. They're really at the forefront of sculpture production in the world. I think they employ like 150 people. They're doing projects with all kinds of fascinating artists, and most of them really experimental. One thing they know how to do really well is work with wood. They got a lot of wood out there. They're surrounded by it, but they're really good at working with it and milling it. And this is an image of carving this thing out of basswood. And that's the finished piece in basswood. And I like the idea very much of making this like completely artificial, figure out of a totally organic material. I found that juxtaposition of those two things to be kind of interesting. And that's an image of it in the exhibition. And you can see some of the other works in the show here. This is a slightly earlier work in resin. It's a distorted version of the original model. It kind of has a futurist quality to it. These are some more recent works. This white one is painted bronze. This one's polished bronze. And then that's another view of, you can see one view of that piece there, another view of it there, and this is probably the most interesting shot of that sculpture. So all of those works there kind of fit together thematically, and showed a side of the work I think that's just a little bit more, in a way, maybe a little bit more playful or something. But the show worked really well, I thought. And then we had some prints and works on paper behind, you can see. I didn't really get into those today, but perhaps another time. So anyway, that's it. And if you have any questions, I'd be happy to answer them for you. Yeah.
So all of them standing in the lobby, were they all distorted in the same way? Or, oh, okay.
Yeah. Well, they were all distorted like horizontally. Okay. So.
So
I mean,
like,
so they were.
So she's going to ask it again. So it's on the
Oh, okay. Oh, sorry. Go ahead.
so were all of them distorted? All of the ones in the lobby distorted the same way, and was each one exactly the same figure, or?
Yes.
Okay.
And they all came from that original model that you saw, and then that they were all kind of enlarged slightly up to 80 inches tall, and then they were distorted. They weren't stretched vertically.
Yeah.
Like some of the littler figures that I showed you were like stretched this way too. But those were just kind of made bigger, and then they were like stretched out. So one of them was stretched out like, this way, and then another one was compressed that way, and then there was another one that was kind of stretched out diagonally. But the idea is really that it's the axis of motion. So like when we walk around, we're walking around on this like horizontal plane, and that so like as you walk, then they're changing, and then that was the idea.
No, okay. The one piece that you showed with all the bodies that were on the coffin, on like the kind of like big table?
Yeah.
You said that you didn't like the way that was like situated in the space. How would you have liked that piece to be shown? And how many of the tiny figures were in that? Because it looked like maybe like over hundreds of them.
Yeah, so the piece was called 180, and there were 180 figures in that thing. And that number just kind of, I arrived at that number just because as I was making it, I was adding and adding and adding and adding to the pile until I felt that it was kind of big enough to convey, a certain scale or a certain number. Like big enough so that it was a number that became kind of hard to see. So just the context in general of like having it in the cafeteria surrounded by like the food, and people were constantly like eating, like some people were sitting on the sculpture and like eating, and I mean it was I find that piece to be like a really somber. It's like just a very somber piece, and I feel like it needs like a huge empty, like naturally lit space where you can go in and really like, I mean, I think some people misconstrued it as being like vaguely sexual or something, which I thought was perverse, frankly. But to me, it's like, it's like this mass grave or something. I mean,
I kind of got it with, back in World War II, when the Jewish people were in the camps, they would just pile up the bodies and everything. That's what I got from it.
yeah,
You said
yeah.
it was linked to like the war in Iraq, so it has like a tie to that. But
Yeah, I mean, and I think that the slight difference there for me was that because all of these, there was no blood, there's no guts, there's no, like they're somehow all uniform and sterilized to some degree, in their uniformity and their sort of presentation without the blood and without all the gore. That spoke to, at least to my thinking at the time, to the relationship of our detachment from the war. Like we're all just sitting back here in America getting this terrible information every day, and it's sort of anesthetized, the information is anesthetized by the fact that we're just disconnected from it and then it's sort of coming through in the Yahoo feed. You know what I mean? So that was the idea of the piece. And I feel like, sometimes you kind of rush into making things, and that piece, by the way, didn't sell, not surprisingly. And also got a lot of feedback that was not great. And so, sometimes I think you take risks and you make things sometimes, especially when you're like a little younger. And I think that's great. Like, I'm really glad I made that thing, but it was hard. It was just everything about that was hard. The making of it, the way in which it was shown, the feedback, my own struggles with it, everything. It was just hard, not sitting on a shelf, in my studio, taking up a huge amount of space. So, but at the same time, like that, sometimes you just get this thing where you feel like you have to do something, to make something, and you do. So.
I like the fact that you use your old like the waste from your work to make newer work. Do you use only your wasted material, or do you use other garbage that you find on streets or places?
That's a really good question, and I didn't really talk about that. But yeah, so I started out using mostly my own materials, and then really quickly I started to incorporate other things. So stuff that I would find on the street, pick up on the beach. I would go to junk yards and just kind of look for materials. And then after I used up all of my own stuff, I literally used up a tremendous amount of stuff. Then I actually went out and started collecting things, even going on eBay and buying old stuff and using them in it. So they all have this different, some of them have a junkier character, and then some of them have a much more kind of curated character. And some of them are mostly just things that are very personal to me, and others are almost none of my stuff, and some are a combination of the two. And one of the things I noticed is that when I was making them, people would come up to me and say oh, there's, that thing, and that a lot of the things that I had, that my kids used and stuff, were the same things that so many other people's, had or their families used. And so there's this kind of commonality in objects that does, it's tell a story about everybody and not just me. So
yeah, I like those. I like the artists that use garbage. It feels like you're recycling and using garbage in a beautiful way.
Yeah, I love the idea of that, and I'm constantly trying to think of ways to do it in other pieces.
Thank you for the presentation. It was great. So a couple of us have been working with having scans made of our bodies, and one of the first things about that, there's this really weird experience the first time you, I guess the first time you experience a physical iteration of yourself that's not you, and it's with the digital technology and whatnot, it's a new way of seeing yourself, objectively,
Mm-hmm.
So that's kind of bizarre. And that's something that I'm still fairly new with, but as you make more iterations and you experience that more, it becomes kind of numbing, and the self in that is kind of lost. How's that affected your work after making so many?
Yeah, so as I said, most of my work is about this idea of the loss of identity. And I think, just by virtue of this, you nailed it on the head. It's when you scan your body and you look at it as a digital kind of a print, it's an erasure. It's basically there's really nothing about it that you can look at and say, oh, that's this tactile person. There's, it doesn't have any of the warm traits of being in the room with a real human being. Right? It's that's gone. But at the same time, it can be highly precise in its accuracy, of the original, because it's essentially a 3D photograph, right? When you scan something and print it, it's like a 3D photograph.
Exactly.
So I became really interested in the idea of, you start with this thing which basically is this kind of erasure of a person, but then through the sort of process of turning that back into a physical sculpture, the making of an object, the insistence of real experience with sculpture, because sculpture is different from even from painting. It's so insistent on physical space, on you know, the actual experience of being with it, that just the act of making a sculpture is like making. I mean, it's like the idea of making a sculpture is tied in many ways, I think, to the notion of being in the room with another person. In other words, we make these objects and we insist on experiencing them sort of in a real, you know, in a real environment, then we're sort of insisting on real physical space rather than the digital space. So that those two things kind of like are a dialectical situation. It's like you're setting up a situation of contradictions. So you're starting with something that's essentially, you know, about a virtual experience, and then you're putting it back into real experience. So to me, it's like virtual reality, but it's actually better than virtual reality. And we haven't even gotten to the point where we're a few years away from really having this immersive virtual reality experience. But I think that, like, you know, you can do that, I think, with sculpture. And I think it's been happening for thousands of years. I mean, I feel like, you know, you go and you look at, you go to Italy and you go and look at Bernini, or you go and look at the Koros figure in the Met, for example. And I mean, there's just this very profound kind of physical experience that sculpture can bring. And I still think that that's unchanged. Like that's where this conversation with the past is interesting in all art, you know? It's that the baseline effect of the power of these things doesn't go away. You know, it's just the form that it takes can change slightly depending on the tools at one's disposal or the moment that it's being made, but that brute force of experience, that kind of like love or that insistence on lived experience and physical interaction is like, it's just there. And that's completely different from the reality of like the internet. It's the opposite.
Thank you.
So I have a question for you.
Yes.
You know, you continue to make references, and you have a rich trove of references that are ancient, they're contemporary, so on and so forth. You even didn't mention some references, which I think would be applicable to your work. So I can only draw the conclusion, of course, that, you know, like many artists living in a postmodern age, that history is a kind of a material for you. And I'm curious if you would describe that relationship to history differently than, say, an artist from another period, like Rodin, for example. History was present in his work as well, not in a postmodern sense, but in a sort of late 19th century impressionist, you know, something or other. How would you distinguish, or what is it about you in the 21st century? What's your approach to history that's different from that previous one?
Well, I think, you know, if you look at sort of postmodern deconstructivism, the takeaway essentially is that things should be scrutinized and pulled apart and examined for what they are, for their sort of different aspects, and for how those aspects are affected by external factors. And I think that what's been going on more recently over the last 10 years or so is a little different than that sort of basic postmodernist approach. And I would say that in the sense that I think a lot of artists are going back to traditional craft, traditional making, crafting things by hand, looking at periods of art that were really overlooked for a long period of time, like 19th century sculpture, for example, or you know, easel painting. But what is the same, I think, about the postmodernists is that artists today feel free to sample from any number of periods of history, and sort of, you know, grab one piece here and one piece there and sort of put it together. Now, sometimes those things can fuse into a single work that's still got this gestalt kind of effect of a modernist, you know, form, a singular form. But more often, I think it's more of a pastiche. So, I'm thinking of my friend Carol Beauvais, who's an artist sculptor who has an amazing show up right now at David Zwirner, New York, which I would really suggest that you go see. And I say that just because it's just so beautiful that when you go see it, you'll be happy you saw it, and you'll just be smiling, and you'll be psyched that you saw it. It'll make you feel good. But what she's doing is she's combining like a couple of different strategies of earlier sculpture together in one form. So she's got some like really twisted, like mangled pieces of found metal that maybe call to mind like John Chamberlain. And then she has some like really high polished kind of minimalist forms that she's kind of integrated and welded into these found pieces of metal. And then she has sort of a third component, which are these kind of really beautifully painted, sand-blasted, like painted, bent forms, which are sort of in between the two. They look like some of the plop art that you see in front of like office buildings, you know, out across the world. And she's taken all these three aesthetics and kind of put them together, kind of curated them together. But unlike her previous work, where you have maybe a tabletop with a few objects that she's found on it together, you know. In these works, they're literally welded and fused together, and they reminded me of cubism in a way, like analytical cubism, like the way Picasso would take collages and pieces of newspaper and any kind of random object and just kind of put it together into this composition. And so they remind me a little bit of that, but they feel new. So I think she's a good example. And with my work, I think a lot of it for what I've made so far, most of these ideas of kind of taking from surrealism or from futurism or from early Greek sculpture or whatever, and combining them with other things like the technology and the interest in biometrics and so forth, it all sort of finds its way into a singularity, like so that there aren't it isn't a composite of different forms, except for the resin heads, which have a different thing going on. But yeah, so I think what's exciting in a way about now is that it's just wide open. As you were saying earlier, I mean, it's really wide open, both in terms of sampling from history and sampling from anything that's out there around you in culture, any material, really. It's a wide open time, which I think is exciting.
Are there any more questions? Okay.
Thank you. For your resin heads, did you start off with those with a concept in mind for each head or collectively as a group? And when you started to choose what you filled them with, did it become apparent as to what it might end up speaking as a whole?
Yeah, I didn't really get into that. I should have talked a little bit more about that because I started on it, but then I stopped. And I guess when I started making them, I wanted to make an installation of 50 and have them all together as like one big thing, where you would really get a sense of the scope of all the different material together in it. Because if you take the stuff out of each of those heads and put it on the floor, you'd be dumbfounded at how much stuff it spreads out in a crazy way. And then when it's compacted in the head, it becomes this really denser thing. And that just wasn't feasible at the time. It wasn't feasible. I wasn't getting offers to do a big show of them. I'd only made a couple. I didn't have the budget to just do all of that and then wait to do a big installation. So I had to just start making them, and I made 10 and then did that show of the 10. And when I first started making them, one of the things that I was interested in was that when I was filling them up, I'm not really conscious of what they're going to look like because I'm just kind of putting things in the mold. So you can imagine like the head upside down on the floor with the neck being the hole into which you're filling. And so you're putting stuff through this kind of neck hole into the mold, upside down and inside out. In the beginning, I just started dumping things in there because I didn't even want to think about composition. Because I think for me and for a lot of sculptors, one of the reasons you're a sculptor is because you want to get away from composition. It's like composition is a huge problem in art. Of course, composition is so much to do with art, but it's also this huge problem that a lot of people have tried to circumvent in one way or another. And so I started doing it that way. I thought, oh, this is brilliant because I don't even have to think about what they're going to look like. I'm just going to dump it all in there. And that's what I did in the beginning. But then I realized after I popped the first one out of the mold and looked at it that, of course, I had been thinking about composition. That unconsciously I'm placing certain things in certain places next to other certain things. And of course, the color composition of the whole thing was decided on by me before too, because by laying them all out together, deciding what's going to be in the head, what's not going to be in the head, all of that was a conscious decision-making process. So then that was helpful in a way, because then I started realizing that, well, maybe I've just got to get past this whole problem I have with coming to terms with composition and realize that maybe I'm okay at composition. Like maybe I can do it. And then so I started to think about them. I liked the fact that in all of them, there was still that kind of slight removal of control, that because I'm putting the objects in inside out and upside down, I won't really be able to know exactly what it's going to look like until it pops out. So that when they would come out of the mold, it was really exciting. It was like unwrapping a Christmas present. I was like, oh my God, what's it going to be? Oh, weird, okay. And that's what, I guess that's why I ended up making like 45 of them, because each one was like different, even though it was basically just the same process that I was going through. And so, so then I got, like, by the end I was getting way more, crafty about it. I was like, well, I'm gonna order this thing on eBay that's, this 70s red ceramic vase that is gonna work really well with this taxidermy, fish or whatever. I was really thinking about it like that, So I guess I learned something in doing them. And I don't know if it really mattered, like some were good and some weren't as good, but you couldn't really make a terrible one, So,
Okay, good. Thank you very much, Richard.
thank you.